Good morning. It's 9:35 a.m. on April 29th, 2001. When I first came to Texas, shortly after I arrived in Texas, I found out about a public law library in Houston. It was on the first floor in the building where the Harris County Attorney's Office is. As you entered the lobby of the building, you could see through some sliding glass doors where the library is. And on the way from the entrance to the building to the entrance to the library, there was also a little lobby. They had display cases. It was almost like a museum exhibit. When I first went there, the first display they had was on the Magna Carta. I would look through it sometimes when I was on my way in and out of the library. But very shortly after that, at the beginning of 2017, without telling anybody, they changed the display. The display was for a time in the history of the state of Texas where there was what was developed named Crystal City. Crystal City was a complex of prison camps for German prisoners of war in the United States. Among the things that happened as part of these camps were the internment of entire families. Now, while there were other prisoner of war camps or other prison camps throughout the United States in order to detain people who had some lineage or connection with countries that had been identified as enemies of the United States, Crystal City had its own unique qualities about it. Part of that had to do with the history of the early Republic of Texas and the state of Texas and its relationship with the German community, specifically German community. In early time of Texas, there was a very, very specific pseudo-legal relationship that the public of Texas had with an element of the German society, understanding as we do that Germany itself was in flux at that time in terms of its definition and composition. And this German community that engaged with the United States had a different understanding specifically about how to engage with the indigenous population. Now, there will be, at some point, greater discussions and discernments about the implications of that fact. But it's also a fact that at some point in time, people from the United States and from the United Kingdom and elsewhere took it upon themselves to organize a tribunal of international legal scholars, people that were committed to the rule of law, to constitutional law, to human rights, to convene a trial of war crimes in Germany for what the Nazis had done, for what the German National Socialist Party and those that operated under their liege committed. Among those trials were a trial of 16 judges and members of the legal community. I'm very disappointed to think that after more than 3.5 years, going on 4, the murder of 16 members of the United States military on American soil and the horrendous crimes it was connected to have still been refused any acknowledgement by anybody that purports themselves to be an officer of the law, a practitioner of the law, and much less a judge of the law, up to and including a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, the legal system under the Nazis was different than what we purport in the United States to be our legal system. But there have been pseudo-judicial operations occurring with greater frequency completely outside of the bounds of the Constitution. And I contend that among many things, there is demonstrable proof that all the way up to the level of the Supreme Court of the United States, they've been involved in a secret conspiracy that legally qualifies as genocide. Among the crimes of genocide is a prevention or preclusion or elimination of the means by which people from certain ethnic or national groups are able to reproduce themselves to sustain their population. Forced sterilization or compelling people into prostitution and then requiring abortion in the event they get pregnant legally qualifies as such a crime, I contend. Forcing somebody into a situation where their only options for intimacy or community are to be ones with the intention of so defaming and slandering their community so as to determine the only options for expression of themselves is to engage in crimes, the implications of which are unconscionable, should be considered accordingly. Now, my understanding is that the judicial branch of government has many committees. In the Federal Civil Judicial Procedure and Rules of 2017, which is the standard I have been using when I have attempted to engage the federal district court system, there are listed a standing committee on rules of practice and procedure, an advisory committee on appellate rules, an advisory committee on bankruptcy rules, an advisory committee on civil rules, an advisory committee on criminal rules, an advisory committee on evidence rules. One of the former members of one of these committees is now a justice of the Supreme Court. And in all this time, 2 justices of the Supreme Court have been murdered without a word from any of them. This says something about the profundity of the dereliction of duty by those claiming to be representatives of the law of the United States of America. I contend that, unfortunately, the only real justice we can afford in the United States is some manner of recalibrating the huge loss to the world by the failure of American leadership in this regard. The members of the judicial branch of the government are going to have to come clean. Using your clients as human shields is not acceptable, and denying certain citizens the rights to due process just because members of your professional milieu have already claimed them and their livelihoods as their own personal private property for use as desired entails a commitment to something other than what you allege to espouse. We don't have the time to deal with this in this regard. We need to have the justices of the Supreme Court of the United States relieved of their command until further notice. It behooves people within the legal community to understand their own self-interest in demonstrating something close to relevancy. What has been called down is completely unacceptable. I know I am a very stubborn person, but I'm a fair person. And if I can be treated the way I have with absolute impunity and absolute inhumanity, how many other people have been treated likewise? I believe the Supreme Court of the United States, as currently constituted, at least prior to the assumption of Justice Amy Coney Barrett, willingly and knowingly scheduled its caseload to aid and abet a global bioterrorist attack. They knew what they were doing in the autumn of 2019, and in their arrogance, they thought they could cover it up. They did not. And what they've done since then is make a mockery of us. Made a mockery of us that still look to them to have any relevancy or to provide a standard of justice by which we could measure the others. a standard of justice by which we could measure the actions of others that otherwise seem so unconscionable. We've all been failed in this regard, and responsibility needs to be taken. They allowed themselves to be put in legacy with an understanding that part of the commitment that may be called upon would be to take this very step themselves. And they've refused to apply anything close to an internal control against their own hubris, and the rest of us are supposed to pay for it. What they've called down is a national fatalism. They will genocide this entire country if they're not stopped. And that cannot be allowed to happen. Regardless of whether you're white or black, regardless of what your census demography determined for you, even if it was stolen for somebody else's appropriation, this is a national genocide. And if, as it may be revealed, there was an intent to create it because certain people believed that they were already advantaged to benefit from genociding their own country, then that needs to be treated with the only remedy that is appropriate. We have a right to justice in these regards before we end up being extincted ourselves.